your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, thanks for joining us for a look back at Alberta this week. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in Calgary Wednesday discussing the Alberta government's plan to bring in sheriffs to patrol the streets and bus shelters. The province is going to boost policing in downtown Calgary by deploying 12 sheriffs to work with city police. Poilievre says more needs to be done to protect people in cities which he says are simply coming apart.
This is a problem from coast to coast, so we can't blame a local police force, municipal government, or even province. It's just as bad, if not worse, in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. Obviously, the problem is national in nature, and it has happened after 8 years of Justin Trudeau. People are falling into poverty. You got a fifth of people are cutting their groceries, or they're cutting their meals because they can't afford to eat. And so then they're ending desperate and on the streets and addicted to drugs. And that's because of the inflationary policies Trudeau's implemented that have driven up the cost of everything.
Public Safety Minister Mike Ellis says the goal is to try and deter social disorder and criminal activity. He says no one should feel scared or afraid to go out at night or to ride public transit.
The aim of this pilot project is to enhance CPS's ability to provide a visible presence with the addition of Alberta sheriffs while also responding to community concerns and getting help for people who need it. At its most basic, these kind of patrols can mean that there's a faster response when there's an urgent call nearby. Whether this call is a distress in an overdose, an act of social disorder or criminal activity, having patrols actively patrolling with more boots on the ground helps to ensure that the appropriate response happens in a timely fashion.
The 3-month pilot project, which begins February 27th and runs until the end of May, is similar to one already announced for downtown Edmonton. The province announced measures to help make life more affordable for post-secondary students. Minister of Advanced Education Dimitrios Nicolaides says these new measures will help all students deal with higher costs during these challenging times of high inflation. The new measures include capping domestic tuition increases at 2%, reducing interest rates on student loans to the prime rate, doubling the student loan interest-free grace period from 6 months to 12 months, and increasing the repayment assistance plan from $25,000 to $40,000, allowing more students to benefit from the program. Some post-secondary students are applauding the government's announcement.
But with the rising cost of living and higher tuition, working just one job or working part-time throughout the school year is barely enough to get me by. That's why I am so glad that the Alberta government is introducing new affordability measures and that will positively impact students across all of Alberta. These changes will benefit thousands of students, and I look forward for benefiting on the extended grace period when I graduate in 2024. It also puts my mind at ease knowing that when the grace period finishes, I will pay less interest in the long run with my student loans as I begin a new career in marketing.
Alberta Health Minister Jason Copping says the province will invest more into our health workforce to address a number of health workforce challenges. That includes $158 million in budget 2023 to ensure Alberta has the medical professionals needed now and in the future.
Some investments would include $90 million to strengthen programs to attract and retain rural physicians, $29 million to fulfill the government's commitment in the agreement signed with the Alberta Medical Association that specifically focuses on underserviced rural and remote communities, $7 million for the targeted recruitment of 500 internationally trained nurses from the United States and the United Kingdom, and $1 million to fund the Provincial Nurse Navigator Program, which support all nurses immigrating to Alberta.
The Vice President of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees responded to the Copping announcement. Bobby Joe Borody says what the province was proposing on Thursday was really lacking in details.
Most notably, what we thought was lacking was any benchmarks or targets. So when you don't know what it is you are ultimately trying to achieve, it's hard to say if that's actually enough money or not.
The final verdict, originally set for February 17th, has now been moved to May 2nd for street preacher Arthur Pawlowski, turned leader of the Independence Party of Alberta. Pawlowski's two-day trial wrapped up 2 weeks ago. He's being charged with inciting mischief, counseling interference with critical infrastructure, and failing to keep the peace when he spoke at the Coutts border blockade last winter. He has pleaded not guilty to these charges. Well, humans are always looking for the greener grass and maybe the white sandy beaches too. After the break, we dive into why Canadians are leaving the country and heading to Mexico to live. Well, there seems to be a large number of Canadians moving to Mexico. Back in the day, snowbirds were mostly known to congregate towards areas like Arizona, Texas, and Florida. But now Canadians are heading even further south to Mexico and beyond. One such Canadian is Steph Farr, who says she discovered her part of Mexico to not only be safe, but have excellent health care as well. She makes the idea of moving to Mexico certainly sound attractive, but is the grass actually greener? Have a look.
The subject of politics has been a very divisive one in Canada and the U.S. in recent years. So do you think Mexico gives Canadians and Americans a break from all that political drama?
Absolutely. And that's probably the major feedback that we get when we meet with foreigners that are joining or moving. It's just that it's just simple. It's back to the basics when you come to Mexico. It's really, I like to say, disconnecting from what's going on and able to connect and come back to what's important and being able to shut out and, really just focus on what's important for us and not really just constantly having, our ears filled with with some noise and political noise. And it's just basic, and we're able to escape from all of that.
Now, one thing Canadians love to boast about when we are out of the country is our public healthcare system. What options do Canadians have while in Mexico if they need medical attention?
Of course, there's options of private insurance that's very affordable. And then, of course, many Canadians opt to not even have the insurance because it's just cheaper. The medical system is just cheaper. If you just pay for a case by case, if you want to visit with a GP or you need a specialist, let's say an emergency at the hospital with x-rays can come out to be about $200. That's just an average.
Wow.
But it's the accessibility. Again, doctors will come to your house if need be, even just, for example, traveling to different destinations where we had to get our negative COVID test. They'll come to your house, take the test, send you your results. It's just a matter of having your doctor a phone number away, can call, make an appointment, and you don't have to wait months. Or, it's just literally make an appointment. You could have that x-ray the next day or the MRI the same day. So it's much cheaper even if you are going the private route and you don't have if you're not paying for an insurance either, just appointment by appointment can be relatively or exponentially cheaper than private in Canada. And it's also the accessibility and the timeliness where it's just everything's much faster and convenient.
So for snowbirds who want to spend, say, 6 months down in Mexico and they want to forego the travel insurance, how much money should they set aside for their healthcare then? Do you have a recommendation?
I would say, I would say max, or I don't want to say max, but I would say around $500 a year.
Really? Wow.
Mm-hmm. And that's not considering any type of emergency or whatnot, but 500 is extremely generous.
That's amazing. Now, Mexico has been in the news quite a bit lately. Drug cartels can be a concern for visitors who don't know the area or have never visited the country before. Now, we are hearing news that violence is ensuing following the capture of one of the sons of El Chapo. How concerned should we be if we're considering visiting Mexico?
That's a great question. We get asked that very frequently from potential guests or even travelers that are looking to move. We say, to be honest, it's really about what you're coming to do when you come to Mexico. If you're coming to just enjoy a family vacation and just do your own thing, you're at absolutely no risk. It's really any potential visitor that actually crosses the line or oversteps their boundaries in terms of being involved with the cartel, competing with the cartel, as silly as it may sound. You hear cases of deaths or Canadians that got shot and by by the cartel, but you don't hear the full story behind it, which is that they were actually involved with the cartel, competing in their territory. So to be honest, I consider it extremely safe. My brother moved here 10 years ago, raised his young kids here, gated communities. They're riding their bike, doing their own thing, going to visit their neighbors, just walking over. It's really a very tight community based on the different pockets of where you're living. And I would say it's not something that anyone really needs to be concerned about unless they're going into the party scene or the drug scene. Then I would say, just proceed with caution.
We'll be right back with a look at next steps for Russia and Ukraine, a year into a conflict that's caught the world's attention. Welcome back. Well, we've been following the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There seems to be smoke, fog, and rhetoric from both sides. We want to cut through the clutter and distraction and speak with University of Alberta professor and historian about what he sees as the next steps in this conflict. David Marples and I talked about the role China might play in the months ahead. Have a look. From your background as a historian, can you maybe explain why this conflict, why does it matter so much to Vladimir Putin and the Russian nation, this particular conflict right now?
Well, Russia, and particularly Putin, subscribes to a historical narrative that sees Kiev as a founding state of the Russian state of Muscovy. That the Kievan state in the 10th century that adopted Christianity in 988 was actually the founding principality of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that the three East Slavic nations arose from that, and that history afterwards is always based on that interpretation, that the three states are actually one people, one culture, and one religion, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church. So Putin and others have never really accepted that Ukraine could be independent from Russia. They see Ukraine as a part of Russia. If you like, as a little brother. They were known as the little brother during the Soviet period. And Little Russians is another word that the Russian state has used for Ukraine as well.
And of course, there's been a little bit of rhetoric about the globalist aligned governments wanting to weaken Russia and then move on to China in 2024. Do you feel that the European nations can maintain this push along with the U.S. to continue to see Ukraine as a proxy in this war against Russia?
Well, I mean, I think the United States is not fully committed to doing anything more than push the Russians out of Ukraine. I mean, it's not attempting to threaten Russia in any way, and it's not using, let's say, planes and other weapons that could actually bomb Russian cities. There's no thought of that. There's no real intention to build up this into a major world war. But on the other side of Russia, China has been backing Russia so far. But at the same time, you see some reticence on the part of the Chinese as to how long this war can keep going and how long they should support Russia if the war turns out to be a very long one. Because China's a trading nation, and it cannot really commit itself long-term to a major war in the center of Europe, which is basically where Ukraine is. There may be a possibility, in my view, of some kind of agreement or rapprochement between the United States and China. I mean, obviously now with the balloons being shot down and Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, they didn't help at all. But they've not entirely stopped discussions between Washington and Beijing. And I see them as possibly continuing. Because if China could at least be neutral, then the Russian regime that's in power now would lose a huge base of support and a recipient for its oil and gas now that the Europeans have basically cut off oil and intend to cut off gas supplies as well. So I think that would be really my strategy if I was a president of the United States. I think that is where I would look to China, not as an enemy, but as some country that could actually be brought on board, at least in the short term, to put pressure on Russia. Because otherwise, if Putin has Beijing behind him, he could continue indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective as a historian, how do you see this conflict playing out?
It's very hard to say because much depends on the will of the Western powers to keep supporting Ukraine and how long it can continue. I mean, for example, in 2024, there'll be a new presidential election in the United States. And should, for example, a Republican take over, be it Trump or someone with the same sort of views as Trump, the United States support for Ukraine might diminish. I mean, might stop altogether. Trump has never given any support to Ukraine, and I don't think he would if he came back into power.
Well, the dust continues to settle from the COVID restrictions here in Canada. And after the break, we find reports that might cause one to question the science bias behind wearing masks. What are the results of the scientific research on the effectiveness of masks that we've been wearing? Well, we'll find out next.
All the RCTs, the gold standard of science, come to the same conclusion: no evidence of benefit.
Well, the restrictions and mandates were constantly in our face and on our face. But what information is now available to support closing down businesses and wearing masks? And what about the masks? Who's right? And what science should we believe? Hal Roberts sat down with health researcher and lifestyle advocate Ivor Cummins to discuss what the reports say about the effectiveness of face masks.
What makes you more of a medical expert as opposed to somebody from Alberta Health Services to talk about the efficacy of paper masks?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So basically, I have a biochemical degree, obviously, but the key thing is I spent over 25 years as a leader in complex problem solving, and that involves prosecuting all branches of science. I worked in FDA-regulated medical device and high volume all over, basically. So I have huge experience in getting into the data. Show me the data is my catchphrase for 20 years. And I'm serious on this. So I'd be very different than the generic academics in all the various specialties who can't integrate or put together a big real world picture in many cases, you know, from their specialty. But also the last 10 years, as you said, I have a book out. I've lectured all over the world, East, West Coast, all across Europe and Israel. I've lectured in metabolic health, pretty deep science. So 10 years on metabolic health and the whole kind of health and longevity sphere and all the science within it. So I was very well placed when COVID started, from what I just described, to look at any or all aspects, but also I leverage a worldwide enormous network because of my past of professors in academia, medicine, all the specialties, including virology, immunology, and epidemiology.
So, Ivor, can you give us an idea of how much information is available on the effectiveness of the masks, and not just, you know, maybe the paper masks, but maybe the cloth masks and some of the other ones that were available and still are?
Absolutely. So I'm just referring here to some slides I threw together, a summary. So Emerging Infectious Diseases Journal, May 2020, a publication from a large team of experts, non-pharmaceutical measures for pandemic influenza in non-healthcare settings. And they basically, the quote is, although mechanistic studies, you know, theoretical studies support the potential effect of hand hygiene or face masks, evidence from 14 randomized controlled trials of these measures did not support any substantial effect on the transmission of laboratory confirmed influenza. And coronavirus is the same mechanism. So that was there, and it had pulled together 14 of the best randomized control trials, and only a randomized control trial can prove an effect from your intervention. All the studies we see on masks, the vast majority are utter nonsense. They're associational, confounded ecological studies. They have almost no meaning.
Many people would say that the mask actually doesn't protect you, but it was worn to protect others. How do you respond to that?
But yeah, that is covered actually through statistical analysis, that effect. That was a very clever thing to say because it was slightly harder to demonstrate that that was not true. So you could almost see that as political as well. I'm, as I said, many decades in arguing with experts on things, and sometimes people, use clever arguments, shall we say. So the thing then is you can simply look to Denmark, which was the first SARS-CoV-2 randomized trial, and it showed no effect either. But also you can look from a high level at all the countries in the world, and there was another study with all the counties in America, over 100,000 people, and you can look at all the studies that look for a real world difference between masks, mask mandates, and no mask mandates, like Sweden and I think South Dakota. Lots of them. And I can tell you how there is zero signal of any benefit through all the data of the past 3 years. In fact, if you look at the counties in America with mask mandates and masks versus not, the actual curve for viral infections, the two curves are superimposed. It's the same with North versus South Dakota. It's the same everywhere. If you look at all the data in the world for a supposed benefit and zero correlation or trend shows up, in fact, contradictory trends show up, the case is over. And when you add to that, all the RCTs, the gold standard of science, come to the same conclusion: no evidence of benefit. The case is closed.
Many are working hard to keep farming a family affair. After the break, we hear about plans and tech for spring planting and the next generation of Alberta farmers. Stay with us. Welcome back. Southern Alberta is a hub for agriculture, so naturally Canadian Ag Day is a big deal in these parts. This week's Ag Day saw over 200 farmers and agriculture experts attending the Farming Smarter Conference and Trade Show in Lethbridge. The annual event highlights speakers from across Southern Alberta and Canada to talk about their experience in the ag industry. As BCN's Micah Quinn explains, a local podcaster who spoke at the event chatted about the increase of women getting into farming.
Caitlin Dubin is a first-generation farmer who works with her husband on a certified organic, grain, oilseed, and pulse farm just north of Lethbridge. In 2019, Dubin started the Rural Women podcast to celebrate the stories of women in agriculture.
It's been heard worldwide, been downloaded over 500,000 times, and it's been a great pleasure to share the stories of women in agriculture.
According to Stats Canada, in 2021, 30.4% of Canada's farm operators were female, which is up from 28.7% in 2016.
I think there's always been women in farming and women farmers, but they are building the courage to call themselves farmers now and stepping out of the shadows and being front and center in their farms. And there's more and more young people going into agriculture for so many different reasons, whether it's environmental or they're just looking to grow their own food or whatever it is.
Ken Coles, the executive director of Farming Smarter, told us the annual conference and trade show is a great way to showcase the important work that the organization does right here in Lethbridge.
I hope that our policymakers and our funders will recognize the value and impact of what we do, because we've been challenged with support. So I hope that everybody can help pass the word on. They can hear it from me, but it's a lot better to hear it from all of you if you see value in what we do.
The top minds in agriculture will also be at the Farming Smarter conference and trade show on Thursday. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
And as Micah mentioned, many guest speakers took part in that two-day conference, including Graham Collier from New Farm Canada. Collier spent part of day two talking about ultra-early seeding spring wheat. He explains how this new system is different than a traditional way to seed.
It's a little bit of a mind shift and a mentality change, because traditionally we look at a calendar date for when to go seed, but this system is based on using a soil temperature. So if you think of a calendar date and the time of year and the season, what it's looking like, if you seed on that same calendar date every year, you're seeding at a different point in that growing season every year. If you seed based on a soil temperature trigger, you're going to change your date that you're seeding within the year, but you're going to seed at the same time within the growing season.
Collier says the conference, which takes place next year, is a great way to provide outreach to farmers. The conference wrapped up on Thursday afternoon. Valentine's Day was this past week, but it wasn't all about hearts and roses. Every year on that day, many cities across the country hold walks in memory of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people who are either missing or have been murdered. In the city of Lethbridge alone, about 4,000 red flags were placed at City Hall to bring awareness to the estimated number of how many women and girls are missing.
The city of Lethbridge adopted the national inquiry with regards to MMIWG. And here in the city's work plan, they're recognizing that we can provide local action in recognition of the symbolic nature, but also the hugely important challenges faced by many of the families who are dealing with losses of murdered Indigenous persons across Canada.
An organizer of this year's event says Lethbridge has been holding similar walks for over 16 years, and the message hasn't changed.
When they come out and they say, hey, our family members are missing, they don't go disappearing for no reason. They show up, but nobody's listening. Still to this day, still this is happening. We had a family that went and said, hey, our family member's missing. And they said, no, they're not. And then sadly, they found them a week later. And this happened in our community just within this last year. Nothing has changed. So here, we decided to do this on February 14th to follow suits with our brothers and sisters in Vancouver.
Nationally, there have been over 1,700 confirmed deaths of murdered Indigenous women. The mother of an infant who was sexually abused by her father did not appear in court via CCTV Friday morning. Her lawyer said he's working to sort out an appropriate residence for his client before proceeding with a bail hearing, which is now adjourned until February 24th. The woman faces charges of failure to provide the necessaries of life, while the father faces multiple charges, including sexual assault. The baby girl was only 6 weeks old when her parents were arrested. She continues to recover at Alberta Children's Hospital, and both parents remain in custody. When we return, how necessary is it to have a will prepared if you're single with no kids? It turns out it's very important, and we tell you why after the break.